You know, we always talk about good guys and bad guys, but what about when things get a little more complicated?
Yeah, those lines can definitely get blurry.
That's exactly what we're diving into today. The Gun Trace Task Force in Baltimore. They were this elite police unit making huge drug busts, getting praised for cleaning up the city.
But behind the scenes, whole different story.
Yeah, much darker story.
It turned out this wasn't just a few bad apples. The GTTF case revealed something much deeper, a pattern of corruption that went way beyond a few rogue cops.
And the scale of it is just mind-blowing. Over 2,000 cases, potentially compromised millions in lawsuits, and even more officers charged later down the line.
Yeah, this thing just kept unraveling.
So how did this all come crashing down? Ironically, their own tactics led to their downfall. They planted a GPS tracker on a suspect's car.
Standard procedure for the GTTF, right? Except this time, that little GPS tracker set off a massive FBI investigation.
Through the meme.
Broken boundaries.
And leading this investigation, Special Agent Erica Jensen. She had seen the devastating consequences of police corruption firsthand. Years earlier, an officer she worked with in Chicago committed suicide after being caught in a similar scandal.
Wow, that's heavy. Must have been a lot of pressure on her.
Absolutely. And we're not talking about some simple arrest here. This was a high-stakes operation involving a whole team of FBI agents. Imagine, March 1st, 2017, the command center outside Baltimore is buzzing with tension screens, lit up phones, tapped, every move meticulously planned to make sure this goes down without anyone getting hurt.
And remember, arresting fellow law enforcement, that's a whole different ballgame.
Right, these guys are trained, they're armed, they might even have connections tipping them off.
The risk was huge.
Yep.
Someone could have easily gotten hurt.
So the FBI, they're watching every move and they wait. They wait until Wayne Jenkins, the leader of this task force, shows up at the Internal Affairs building for what he thinks is a minor issue.
I can only imagine the tension in that command center when Jenkins walked through the door.
You can practically hear a pin drop.
Huge relief when they finally got him into custody. And the moment those arrests went public, it set off this chain reaction.
Right. Prosecutors are suddenly looking at thousands of cases they might have to re-examine. Convictions could be overturned, evidence questioned.
Meanwhile, defense attorneys are seeing a chance for their clients who might have been wrongfully convicted to finally get justice.
The whole legal system was flipped on its head. There's even a scene described in the courtroom when the news breaks. It must have been pure pandemonium.
I bet it was. People on opposite sides of the law reacting in completely opposite ways. And then there's Ivan Bates, this defense attorney. He actually became a key player in the whole thing.
Yeah. How did that happen?
Well, Bates was a well-respected defense attorney in Baltimore. And when the news of the arrest broke, he realized he had clients who were caught up in the GTTF's mess.
So initially he's representing people who'd been targeted by this task force.
Right. But he ended up playing a crucial role in helping the prosecutors build their case.
Okay, so the FBI, they've got these high-profile arrests. They're starting to unravel this massive web of corruption. But this is just the beginning, right?
Oh, yeah. Just the tip of the iceberg. The prosecutors knew they had a tough battle ahead, convicting cops. It's notoriously difficult.
Why is that?
Juries, they tend to trust law enforcement. Plus, there was this recent case in Philadelphia where 6 corrupt cops walked free, even though the evidence against them was strong.
So the odds were stacked against them. They needed something or someone to crack this thing wide open.
And that's where Jamal Rayam comes in, one of the GTTF officers.
Imagine the pressure on him. Stay silent, risk going down with everyone else, or turn on his own team and face the consequences.
A tough call. And Rayam was facing a potential 20-year sentence if he kept quiet.
So what made him flip? Was there a specific moment?
It seems like he realized cooperating was his only shot at a lighter sentence. In a proffer session, basically a meeting where a suspect offers info in exchange for a potential deal, he confessed. He started by admitting to the GPS tracker incident, which dragged John Cluell, another officer, right into the middle of it.
So one domino falls and the rest start to follow. But the other officers, especially Wayne Jenkins, the leader, they weren't going down without a fight, were they?
Jenkins, even from jail, he was trying to hold the line. He was convinced they could beat the charges. That is, until they found out about the wiretaps.
Wait, they were being recorded.
Oh, yeah. They had bugged Momadou Gondo's car.
One of their own. That's risky.
High risk, but high reward, too. Those recordings. They became the smoking gun. Conversations about stealing money and drugs, planting evidence, falsifying reports. It was all there in their own words.
Damning evidence. You'd think that would be the end of it. But these were cops. And Jenkins, the ringleader, he was still holding out hope.
He was their leader, the one they all looked up to. Even with the evidence piling up, he refused to cooperate. The prosecutors, they knew they needed him to flip if they wanted to take down the whole operation.
So they offered him a deal, right? What did he say?
They laid it all out, the evidence, the potential consequences, hoping he'd crack. But Jenkins, loyal to the end, refused to name his team. Instead, he threw them a decoy, a supposed drug dealer named Donald Stepp, claiming Steck was the mastermind behind everything.
Trying to deflect the blame. But the prosecutors weren't buying it, were they?
Not one bit. Something about Stepp just didn't add up. They noticed all these phone calls between him and Jenkins on the same days as the robberies. And that's when a new theory emerged. Maybe Jenkins was giving the stolen drugs to Stepp to sell.
So Stepp becomes the new target. Did they have anything solid on him?
They needed more evidence. So they put Officer Christopher Toland on surveillance duty watching Stepp's every move. And one night Toland got lucky. He witnessed what looked like a drug deal going down right in Stepp's driveway.
So they caught him red-handed.
Not quite. They needed more than suspicion. Toland followed the woman who left Stepp's place, pulled her over for a minor traffic violation, and bam, drug paraphernalia in plain sight. Then they find cocaine in her purse. Enough for a search warrant on Stepp's house.
Looks like they're finally getting somewhere. But was Stepp as tough as Jenkins?
Different situation entirely. Stepp wasn't a cop. He didn't have that same code of silence protecting him, and when the raid turned up a stash of drugs, he knew he was in serious trouble.
So he caved, decided to cooperate.
With a potential life sentence looming and a young child to think about, Stepp made a deal. He agreed to testify against Jenkins and the others.
That's a big win for the prosecution.
Huge. But he had something even more damning than his words. Videos.
Videos of what?
Videos of him and Jenkins robbing people. Stepp had been recording their crimes, probably as insurance or leverage. And those videos, they were the final nail in Jenkins's coffin. The prosecutors finally had him trapped with undeniable proof.
You can almost feel the betrayal. The guy Jenkins trusted to handle the stolen goods turns out to be his downfall.
It's a crazy twist of fate. And for Jenkins, the reality of his situation finally hit.
So what happened? Did he finally confess?
At his plea hearing, the once untouchable leader of the GTTF was a shadow of his former self. His family devastated the courtroom, heavy with tension. The judge read out this long list of charges outlining the extent of his crimes. It was a far cry from the hero cop image he once projected.
Sounds like justice was finally being served. But what about the rest of the GTTF? Did they all go down with Jenkins?
Most took plea deals, accepting responsibility for their actions in exchange for lighter sentences. But two officers, Daniel Herzl and Marcus Taylor, they decided to fight the charges. They were the only ones who went to trial.
And at the trial, were they able to convince the jury they were innocent?
The trial was a powerful moment. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence, including those damning videos from Steppry. But it was the victim testimonies that really resonated.
They got to speak, the people who'd been robbed by these officers.
They did. And their stories were heartbreaking. One victim, Ronald Hamilton, he testified about being robbed by Jenkins and Herzl. He talked about the terror he and his wife felt, the lasting trauma. It was raw and powerful. He was angry, and understandably so. His testimony really brought home the human cost of the GTTF's actions.
I can only imagine how difficult it must have been for him to relive that experience in front of the officers who wronged him.
Must have taken a lot of courage. And during cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to discredit him, implying that the money was from illegal activities. A common tactic to undermine victims, especially in cases involving drugs or money.
Trying to shift the blame. Did the jury buy it?
No, they didn't. They found Herzl and Taylor guilty.
What were their sentences?
18 years each.
Wow, that's a long time. What about Jenkins? What was his final sentence?
Jenkins got 25 years. The others received shorter sentences depending on their level of involvement. But the impact of this case, it went far beyond individual punishments. The GTTF scandal exposed a culture of corruption within the Baltimore PD, a system that allowed these officers to operate with impunity for years.
This wasn't just a story about a few bad cops.
No, this was about a broken system. And while the GTTF might be gone, the echoes of their crimes continue to reverberate through the city.
So the investigations over the officers are behind bars, justice is served. But is that really the end of the story? Had things really changed in Baltimore?
That's the question that haunted everyone.
And did they find an answer?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. Remember that decoy Jenkins tried to use, Donald Stepp?
Yeah, what about him?
He wasn't just some random drug dealer. For years, Stepp had been a confidential informant for the Baltimore Police Department, feeding them information about the drug trade.
Wait, hold on. The guy Jenkins was giving stolen drugs to was working with the police? That's messed up.
It gets even more tangled. Remember those wiretaps from Gondo's car? There's this one recording where Jenkins actually brags about how he and Stepp have a mutual understanding.
A mutual understanding, what does that even mean?
It suggests a deeper level of complicity, a relationship that went beyond the typical informant-handler dynamic.
So we're talking about a system where corrupt cops aren't just breaking the law, they're potentially using informants to cover their tracks. That's terrifying.
It raises some serious questions about oversight and accountability. How could someone like Stepp, with his history, remain a trusted informant for so long?
Makes you wonder how many other cases might be out there, where informants were used to facilitate or cover up police misconduct.
A chilling thought for sure. This whole case really exposed the underbelly of the Baltimore Police Department.
Didn't it? And it wasn't just about individual officers going rogue. It pointed to a culture where corruption was allowed to fester, where the ends were seen as justifying the means.
You hit the nail on the head. And that's where the whole concept of noble cause corruption comes in.
Noble cause corruption. What's that?
It's this idea that officers believe they're doing the right thing, serving a greater good, even if it means bending or breaking the rules.
So they're justifying their actions by saying, hey, we're catching the bad guy, so it doesn't matter how we do it.
In a way, yes. They might start small, maybe planting a little weed on a suspect they know is guilty but can't quite prove it. But that can easily escalate to more serious offenses. Stealing money, planting guns, fabricating evidence.
It's a slippery slope. Once you start rationalizing those smaller infractions, where do you draw the line?
Exactly. And that's the danger. Noble cause corruption. It can erode the very foundation of the justice system. It creates a system where the truth becomes malleable. People get convicted based on fabricated evidence or coerced confessions.
Makes you wonder how many innocent people might be behind bars because of this kind of misconduct.
It's a question that haunts a lot of people. And it also erodes public trust in law enforcement. If you can't trust the police to uphold the law, who can you trust?
Absolutely. And that lack of trust, it has this ripple effect. When communities don't feel safe reporting crimes or cooperating with investigations, it creates a vacuum where criminal activity thrives.
It's a vicious cycle.
So what can we do to break it? After a scandal like this, what steps can be taken to rebuild trust and make sure something like this never happens again?
Well, it's not a simple fix.
Yeah.
There needs to be a fundamental shift in the culture of policing. We need to move away from this us versus them mentality and focus on building relationships between law enforcement and the communities they serve.
But how do you do that, especially in a city like Baltimore where there's so much history of tension and mistrust between the police and the Black community?
It's a multifaceted approach. First and foremost, accountability. When officers break the law, they need to be held responsible regardless of their rank or badge number.
So no more getting away with it because of the blue wall of silence.
Exactly. We need independent investigations of police misconduct, transparent disciplinary processes, and prosecutors who are willing to go after cops when they commit crimes.
But isn't that easier said than done? We've seen how difficult it is to convict police officers even with strong evidence.
It's a challenge, but not impossible. We need to change the laws that make it so hard to hold police accountable. Eliminate qualified immunity, which shields officers from civil lawsuits.
Right.
Create stronger mechanisms for independent oversight.
What about civilian review boards? Do those actually work?
They can't if they have real power. They need to be independent, have access to all the evidence, and be able to make binding recommendations for discipline or even termination.
And body cameras. We hear a lot about those, but do they really make a difference?
Body cameras can be a valuable tool for transparency and accountability. They can provide evidence in cases of misconduct, and they can help deter officers from engaging in abusive behavior in the first place.
But they're not a cure-all, right? There are still issues with how the footage is stored, accessed, and released.
Absolutely. Technology is a powerful tool, but it's only as good as the policies and procedures that govern its use.
So it's not just about slapping a camera on every officer. It's about creating a system of accountability that uses technology effectively and fairly.
Exactly. And that system needs to include robust training for officers, de-escalation techniques, implicit bias awareness, community policing strategies.
So teaching officers how to interact with the community in a way that builds trust rather than fear.
Precisely. And that requires a shift in mindset. We need to move away from this warrior mentality that's so prevalent in law enforcement and towards a guardian mentality.
A guardian of the community rather than a warrior fighting a war on crime.
That's the idea.
It sounds idealistic, but I can see how that kind of shift could make a real difference. But what about the communities themselves? What role do they play in all this?
Community engagement is crucial.
Sure.
We need to create spaces for dialogue between law enforcement and community members where people can voice their concerns, build relationships, and work together to find solutions.
So breaking down those barriers and recognizing that everyone has a stake in creating safer, more just communities.
Exactly. And that requires a commitment from everyone involved. Law enforcement needs to be willing to listen to the community, to acknowledge past harms, and to work collaboratively to build trust. And communities need to be willing to engage in that dialogue, to hold law enforcement accountable, and to work together to find solutions.
Sounds like a long road ahead.
It is. But the GTTF scandal, it was a wake-up call. It forced Baltimore to confront some uncomfortable truths about its police department and about the culture of policing in America.
Mm.
And while there's still a lot of work to be done, it also sparked a movement for change, a demand for accountability and justice that continues to this day.
It's easy to get lost in the big picture of systemic corruption and feel like nothing will ever change. But the GTTF case, it also reminds us that individuals can make a difference.
Absolutely. Think about Special Agent Jensen, driven to root out corruption, or Ivan Bates, a defense attorney who ended up helping the prosecution. They each played a crucial role.
And what about the victims? They didn't have badges or legal expertise, but they bravely stepped forward to share their stories, knowing they might be re-traumatized in the process.
Their testimonies were incredibly powerful. They put a human face on the crimes committed by the GTTF. It's easy to get caught up in the legal complexities, but hearing those personal accounts of fear and betrayal really hits home.
It also makes you appreciate the role of investigative journalism in all this, essentially. Justin Fenton, who covered the story for the Baltimore Sun, did incredible work uncovering the truth.
Absolutely. Without dedicated journalists willing to dig deep and hold those in power, accountable stories like this might never come to light. They play a crucial role in a functioning democracy.
So we've talked about the corruption, the investigation, the systemic issues. What does this all mean for us, the everyday citizens? What can we do to prevent something like this from happening again?
Well, it can start by being informed. Read investigative reports, follow reputable news sources, and think critically about the information we consume. Don't just accept what you hear at face value.
So question everything. Be skeptical, especially when it comes to those in positions of authority.
Exactly. Demand transparency from your elected officials and hold them accountable for their actions. Support organizations advocating for police reform, criminal justice reform, and social justice.
And it's not just about voting or donating, right? We can get involved in our communities, attend town hall meetings, speak out against injustice, amplify the voices of those who are often ignored.
Every action, big or small, can contribute to change.
Over.
Educate yourself and others, have those difficult conversations, and don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable society. This case might have exposed the dark side of Baltimore, but it also ignited a spark, a demand for accountability and change that continues to burn bright.
The fight for justice is an ongoing process, and it requires constant vigilance. The GTTF scandal was a stark reminder that power unchecked can corrupt even those sworn to protect us.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the heart of Baltimore's police corruption scandal, we leave you with this. What will you do to make a difference? How will you use your voice, your actions to ensure that justice prevails? Keep learning, stay engaged, and never stop fighting for what's right.
And don't forget to check out Justin Fenton's book, We Own This City. It's a deep dive into the GTTF scandal and the systemic issues that allowed it to happen.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. Remember that decoy Jenkins tried to use? Donald Stepp.
Yeah, what about him?
Turns out he wasn't just some random drug dealer. For years, Stepp had been a confidential informant for the Baltimore Police Department.
He was what?
An informant feeding them information about the drug trade.
So the guy Jenkins was giving stolen drugs to was working with the police? Hold on, that doesn't make any sense.
It gets even more tangled. Remember those wiretaps from Gondo's car? There's one recording where Jenkins is bragging about how he and Stepp have a mutual understanding.
What? A mutual understanding? What does that even mean?
It hints at something more than just a typical informant-handler situation.
Okay, so we're talking about corrupt cops, not only breaking the law, but using informants to help them cover their tracks. That's a whole other level of messed up.
It definitely raises questions about oversight and accountability.
Mm-hmm.
How on earth could someone like Stepp with his history remain a trusted informant for so long?
It's mind-boggling, and it makes you wonder how many other cases are out there where informants were used to cover up police misconduct.
It's a scary thought. This whole case really exposed the dark underbelly of the Baltimore Police Department.
It did, and it wasn't just about individual officers going rogue. It was a culture where corruption was allowed to thrive, where the ends justified the means, as they say.
You got it. And that's where the whole concept of noble cause corruption comes in.
Noble cause corruption, what is that?
It's this idea that officers believe they're doing the right thing, even if it means breaking the rules, like they're serving a greater good.
So they're basically saying, we're catching the bad guys, so it doesn't matter how we do it.
Yeah, kind of. They might start small, maybe planting a little weed on a suspect. They're sure is guilty, but they can't prove it. But then it escalates. Stealing money, planting guns, even making up evidence.
Whoa, it's a slippery slope for sure.
Yeah.
Once you start rationalizing those small things, where does it end?
Exactly. And that's the real danger. Noble cause corruption can completely destroy the justice system. It creates a system where the truth doesn't matter as much, where convictions are based on lies and forced confessions.
It makes you wonder how many innocent people are behind bars because of this kind of thing.
It's a question that a lot of people are asking, and it also destroys public trust in law enforcement. If you can't trust the police to follow the law, who can you trust?
That's a good point. And when communities don't trust the police, they don't report crimes or help with investigations. And that just creates more opportunities for crime.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
So how do we break that cycle? After a scandal like this, what can be done to rebuild trust and make sure something like this never happens again?
It's a tough question. There needs to be a major shift in the culture of policing. We need to move away from this us versus them mentality and focus on building better relationships between law enforcement and the communities they serve.
That sounds good in theory, but how do you actually do that? Especially in a city like Baltimore with all the history of tension between the police and the Black community.
It's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah.
First off, accountability. When officers break the law, they have to be held responsible, no matter what their rank is.
No more getting a free pass because of the blue wall of silence.
Exactly. We need independent investigations of police misconduct, transparent disciplinary processes, and prosecutors who are willing to actually prosecute cops when they commit crimes.
I mean, it sounds good, but that's easier said than done, right? We've seen time and time again how hard it is to get convictions against police officers, even when there's strong evidence.
It's a challenge for sure. But we need to change the laws that make it so hard to hold police accountable. Get rid of qualified immunity, which basically protects officers from civil lawsuits. And we need stronger systems for independent oversight.
What about civilian review boards? Do those actually do anything?
They can be effective, but only if they actually have some power. They need to be independent and have access to all the evidence. Plus, they need to be able to make decisions about discipline or even firing officers.
Okay, what about body cameras? Everybody's talking about those, but do they actually make a difference?
Body cameras can be helpful, for sure. They can provide evidence of misconduct, and they might make officers think twice before doing something wrong.
They're not perfect.
No,
Okay.
there's still issues with how that footage is stored, who has access to it, and how it's released to the public.
So it's not as simple as just giving every officer a body camera. It's about building a system of accountability that uses technology the right way.
Exactly. And that system needs to include training for officers. Things like de-escalation techniques, implicit bias awareness, and community policing strategies.
So teaching officers how to interact with the community in a way that builds trust instead of fear.
That's the goal. It's about changing the way they think, moving away from that warrior mentality that's so common in law enforcement and more towards a guardian mentality.
A guardian of the community instead of a soldier in a war on crime.
Exactly.
I like that. It sounds idealistic, but I get it. That kind of change could really make a difference. But what about the communities themselves? What can they do?
Community engagement is essential. We need to create spaces for dialogue between law enforcement and the people they serve, where people can talk about their concerns, build relationships, and work together to find solutions.
So breaking down those barriers and recognizing that everyone has a stake in making things better.
That's what it's all about. But it takes commitment from both sides. Law enforcement has to be willing to listen to the community, acknowledge past mistakes, and work together to build trust. And communities have to be willing to engage in that dialogue, hold law enforcement accountable, and work together to find solutions.
It's a long road ahead.
It is. But the GTTF scandal was a wake-up call. It forced Baltimore to face some hard truths about its police department and about policing in America as a whole. And even though there's still a long way to go, it also sparked a movement, a demand for accountability and justice that's still going strong.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture, right? Systemic corruption, all that, and feel like, what can we even do about it? But the GTTF case, it's a reminder that individuals can make a difference.
That's so true. Think about Special Agent Jensen, her determination to get to the bottom of it all.
Well,
Or Ivan Bates, a defense attorney who ended up helping the prosecution. They each played such a crucial role.
And the victims, too, they didn't have badges or legal expertise, but they were so brave to step forward, share their stories, knowing it could bring up all that trauma again.
Their testimonies were powerful, man. They really humanized the crimes of the GTTF. It's easy to get lost in the legal stuff. But hearing those personal stories of fear and betrayal, it really hits you in the gut.
Yeah, it does. And it makes you appreciate the role of investigative journalism in all of this. Justin Fenton, who covered this story for the Baltimore Sun, he did some amazing work uncovering the truth.
For sure. Without journalists like him digging deep and holding those in power accountable, these kinds of stories might never see the light of day. They're so important for a democracy to function.
So we've talked about the corruption, the investigation, the systemic issues, but what does it all mean for us, the everyday people? What can we do to prevent something like this from happening again?
Well, step one is being informed. Read those investigative reports, follow reliable news sources, and be critical of the information you're consuming. Don't just take things at face value.
So be skeptical, especially of those in positions of authority.
Exactly. Demand transparency from your elected officials and hold them accountable for their actions. Support organizations that are fighting for police reform and criminal justice reform and social justice.
It's not just about voting or donating, though, right? We can get involved in our communities, go to town hall meetings, speak out against injustice, amplify the voices of those who are often silenced.
Absolutely. Every action, big or small, contributes to change. Educate yourself. Talk to others about these issues. Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
It's about recognizing that we all have a part to play in building a better and more just world. You know, this GTTF case, it exposed the dark side of Baltimore, but it also lit a fire, a demand for accountability and change that's still burning strong today.
The fight for justice never ends. It's a constant battle. The GTTF scandal was a harsh reminder that power corrupts, and even those sworn to protect us can abuse that power.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the heart of Baltimore's police corruption scandal, we want to leave you with this question. What will you do to make a difference? How will you use your voice and your actions to ensure that justice prevails? Keep learning, sleep, stay engaged, and never stop fighting for what's right.
And if you want to learn more about this case, check out Justin Fenton's book, We Own This City. It's a deep dive into the GPTF scandal and the systemic issues that made it possible.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.